Excuse me, I'm just going to record. There we go. I'm the chairman of the Response Marketing Association. I'm also the managing director of Newport Thomson, a trusted advisory firm for privacy and data protection. And I'd like to welcome my guest, David McInerney, who is, what's your role there, David? You're
I'm the commercial manager at Syrenis, so I look after
commercial director. Yeah.
Yeah, so I look after the sort of the revenue side of the business and sort of walk people through the journey that everybody that's on the call today are going to have to undertake with enforcing Bill 64 or being compliant with Bill 64.
Great. So we've got a lot to cover. So I'd like to kind of jump into it and just set a bit of context, if you would, before I start asking you questions and tossing things back and forth. We do have a slide deck, but we're not going to necessarily follow what's on the slides. We're going to have a discussion about consent and Bill 64. And you know, its implications to business and what they're going to have to do in the next couple of years as the law comes into force. And it does come into force on stages. So we'll talk about that. But we want to talk about specifically about what businesses are going to have to do and they're going to be required to do. And if anybody has any doubt, like California sets the precedent for the US data protection, so too does Quebec set the precedent for Canada. So it is a tougher bill than PIPEDA, and it will stand alongside PIPEDA, but it will the commissioner, the information commissioner in Quebec can charge federally. So it's interesting to note that if you do business in Canada, you better pay attention to Bill C-64 or Bill 64. So, you know, really for the past 20 years, we've not had to worry about consent. We've more guided ourselves based on what technology allowed us to do rather than should we do it. And I think what these data protection laws such as GDPR and now Bill 64 are asking us to do is to stop and consider the person on the other end, like the person whose personal information you're using. Stop and think it through. And they've tried not to be too prescriptive, I think, in the laws, but they do. There are some definite do's and don'ts. So, you know, because no consent was the order of the day in most industries, except maybe health and financial sectors, where they treated it with a little bit more sensitivity. But really, for the most part, consent's not been a thing in business, and few organizations give it too much consideration. But then along comes these new data protection laws, and suddenly we not only have to have consent, but we have to prove consent. Having it's one thing. You know, I see often under Castle people claiming that they have consent, but when you ask them to prove it, they're stuttering and stammering like they have no idea where the proof lies. So proving consent is really what we're talking about here, not just having it. And you know, let's take a look. Typically, you went through the introduction of the GDPR, and you got to see how companies handled consent or didn't. If they did manage it at all, how did they do it prior to the GDPR, and what changed with the GDPR?
Well, I think that you know, many organisations didn't sort of track the consent. They might do for the individual pieces of technology that they had in play, but there was never any sort of single single version of the truth to refer back to. And it certainly wasn't something that they'd be able to track and record consent for. So, you know, there was a real sort of hodgepodge of manual processes and a lot of time consuming manual processes. But consent was all over the map, though, to be honest. It was, you know, the early days.
You used an interesting phrase there, one version of the truth. Can you say a little more about that?
Well, organisations that have a global footprint that are operating globally will need to have consent and honour consent depending on where that individual is. Organisations will have lots of different touch and honour points that they need to provide meaning consent for. And there needs to be a single version of the truth, because a consumer or a customer will interact and will interface with different systems through a digital estate. They might come through, details might be accessible through a CRM, they might fill out a form, they might interact with an app, they might visit a domain, they might give snippets of information or pieces of information up across many different touch points. And you need to be able to sort of demonstrate that you're holding that consent in the right way. And as you said in your introduction, Derek, you need to be able to prove that you hold the right consent in the right way.
Right.
So you know, any system or any solution that an organisation looks at and will need to look at, if they're not just going to be managing consent all the time, will have to be one that provides them with that single version of the truth. So what consent do I hold? What consent has this individual given to me? How many times has this individual changed their consent? What am I allowed to do with this data? What consent do I have, and what can I do with the data once it's consented to?
Yeah, this is in effect operationalizing consent.
Absolutely,
is what we're talking about. Is because to claim you have it and not be sure, it's not embedded in your operations. So what we're talking, the automation of consent is what we're talking about is actually operationalizing it, plugging
Absolutely.
it in, so that you don't have to touch it afterwards. Once you set it up,
yeah,
the consumer gives their consent in all areas. It informs the right engines within your organization, your email engine, your call center, whatever. It informs everybody what you do and don't have consents for, and what should be suppressed and what should be utilized.
You're keeping your DPO happy, because you know that you've obtained consent in a compliant way. But then you're also enabling the departments that need to use that data on a day-to-day basis, so they can sort of keep on with confidence that they know that they've got the right consent to be able to pick up the phone and speak to John Doe, send an email out to to an individual, to a campaign list that they've compiled. So it's giving the departments within an organisation the confidence that the data that they hold has the right consent attached to it for them to be able to perform that marketing function. Makes sense.
All right, let's go back to the fundamentals here of Bill 64. Quebec takes the position, like the GDPR, that privacy is an individual right.
Yeah.
And that the federal proposed bill C11 stopped very short of that, and received a lot of criticism because of it. In fact, what the federal government here called a balanced approach was very much in favor of businesses. The thumb was on the scale heavily in favor of businesses carrying on doing exactly what they were doing.
Yeah.
So in a couple of articles that I published back at the end of November when Bill C11 first came out, I really I really clearly stated that I thought that under this law, Bill C-11, that Facebook would have been able to carry on everything they're doing. It would not have, they would have, with consent and 33 exceptions to it, which was written into that law, they could have found an exception for everything they do. One of the things I do like about Bill 64 is it asks for consent, and there's only a couple of exceptions. And they're reasonable exceptions, right?
Yeah.
Things like, legitimate research. And so, they're allowing it, they're allowing a reasonable breach or non-consent. Breach is the wrong word, sorry. They're allowing for you to process data without consent under certain circumstances, but it's very narrow and very tight.
Yeah.
So although the bill stated that consent's required, with only a couple of exceptions, I think this Quebec bill is far deeper in protecting individuals' privacy and their data online than anything we had proposed, and even goes a little bit further than Pepita did, and more important, it's got some pretty heavy fines attached to it. So like the GDPR, the Data Protection Authority, which is the Information Privacy Commissioner in or Information Commissioner in Quebec, will have the power to fine, and the fines are in the same level as the GDPR fines, up in the 10 and 20 millions.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be looked at as, what do I do what will happen to me if I don't sort of comply? The legislation's there, data privacy legislation. If you look at a map on the world, there are very few now territories where there isn't some law that is applicable, and organisations need to look at it from the point of view of how do we better engage with our customers, rather than if I keep on working the way that I am, what will happen to me? It's an opportunity, I think, for organisations, Derek, to look at how they interact with their end users, and look at it as an opportunity to build trust and trust in their brand, and give that confidence to an individual that the company that they're interacting with actually does care about their rights as an individual and their rights in terms of the data privacy and the data that they're handling.
Excellent distinction. I think that if you look at the essence of most of these data protection laws around the world, they're actually forcing us to take better care of our customer. At the end of the day, that is really what they're saying. So we would want to do that as marketers and business people. We would want to do that anyway. So we have to just start stopping and thinking of the implications of what we're doing with their personal data.
Yeah.
When you're advertising in the marketplace, that's one thing. But when you're actually using like personal identifiable information to market to somebody, it's a different kind of marketing. And it's one that's got to come with some respect for that consumer's rights.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And the data protection laws are giving them that right. And in fairness, for those of us who are a little thick, there are some significant fines that are attached to them. So, you can pay me now or you can pay me later, right? And
what we found in the run to GDPR becoming enforceable, it is an opportunity, and we Syrenis as an organisation were engaged or are engaged with organisations that saw it as an opportunity. It was their opportunity to get ahead of their competition. We're going to plant our flag in the sand, and this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to move forward. And it leads to a more engaged database because you're giving them, you're allowing them to give consent in terms of Bill 64. That's clear, it's freely provided, it's informed. You as an individual, you decide the specific purposes or the specific purposes are explained to you. And it means that you've got a more engaged user at the end of the day. You know,
Yeah,
it's,
there are, you know, some pundits say that consumers aren't going to use a preference center, and I think that you know, it might be a little slow at first, only because we've lost the trust collectively as a business community, and it's going to take improved actions, not just talk. You know, we can't be like our politicians where we talk a good fight and then don't do anything. The consumer is going to judge businesses on their actions. And if they start respecting them, I think you'll start to see more interaction and improved consents.
Yeah.
But right now, we've kind of trained them not to trust us with their data. And we have to prove in the next few years that, you know, brand by brand, we are trustworthy.
Yeah.
Right.
And any solution that you put in place allows, that gives you that organization the bandwidth to be able to express that.
I'd like to address what they call the processing of data. And I think there's a disconnect in business today between what the laws consider processing of data and what the average business person might think processing of data means.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I have your email address, that's personal information. And if I choose to email you, that is processing your data.
Yeah.
I have your phone number, personal information. If I phone you, that is personal information. I'm processing against personal information. If I profile you through cookies and build a big file, like a 500 or 5,000 point data file on you, right? That is processing data.
Mm-hmm.
If I keep track of your transactions in my store and I have your purchase history, that's data processing, right? So I think it's really critical that we consider, do we have consent to do all those things? And pretty much the answer today is no. So the challenge in the next 2 years as Bill 64 comes into force is, how do we organize our consent so that we can prove we have it in all areas?
Right. And that's the challenge to any sized organization currently. It's, do you have the right legal wording for the consent to be obtained meaningfully? You know, do you know the different touch points that you have, and how are you going to offer that consent question? You know, how are you going to obtain permission from an individual to process the data in a way that will stand up should you be investigated by the commissioner relevant to that sort of territory? It's, you know, and what we've seen certainly in California is that they are coming after organisations to prove that they hold consent in the right way. We've had a flurry of activity over the last 6 months or so where organisations recognise that this is a real thing and it's not going to go away. And as it changes, or as the legislation becomes enforceable, and finding that people are sitting up and do have to sort of show and prove that they have the right consent to be able to perform the functions and the actions that they do.
Yeah, excellent. Let's take a look at the actual bill itself. So I just want to provide a little bit of the wording and really look at the essence of what Bill 64 is looking for. Any person carrying on an enterprise who, for a serious and legitimate reason, collects personal information on another person must determine the purpose or purposes for collecting the information before doing so. So really what they're doing here is forcing businesses to think through and only collect what you need. And so there's a real clear data minimization embedded in this law. But also there's a requirement to have a very clear statement of purpose. And each time you collect consent for any given thing, you have to say clearly what you're going to do with it. What's the purpose? Why are you collecting it? And it can't be ambiguous, and it can't be so big that it's vacuous and it means nothing. And it can't be so narrow that you can't do anything with the person's data. So this is the language around how you ask for consent is going to be a very critical factor. And you're going to need a system that's flexible enough for you to be able to change the languages, like literally change the language for asking for consent as well as the language you're asking for it in, because you've got various jurisdictions. How you get consent from under the GDPR is slightly different than how you would get it under Bill 64. So you can wire your system that when somebody's coming in from Germany, you know that they need this kind of wording.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
And any solution that any organization will sort of look at need to give them that flexibility to be able to operate on a global scale. So multilingual, multi-jurisdictional, having boxes ticked for territories where you can, something as simple as that, allows an organisation to present the right consent in the right way for where that individual resides or where they're sort of accessing that service from.
To be clear, Stephen's asked a question here. Would tracking this in your contact database not be sufficient, date timed and stamped? And of course it would. For smaller organizations, that is absolutely the route to go. But for large enterprise who keep data all over the place, that one version of the truth becomes a very critical factor. So yeah, and make no mistake, Bill 64 applies to all levels of business, all kinds of organizations. So you can be a two-person shop and Bill 64 applies. You require consent to use people's personal data, period. Stop end sentence.
That's an interesting question, Derek. But it'd be date timed and stamped for when that person made that change. But if that person's gone in and made 50 changes, and you need to demonstrate what their consent statement was on a particular date and time, then if you're just holding one flag against a record, it will only give you what it is currently. It won't give you what it was 6 months ago. It won't give you what the wording was 6 months ago, should that change. So again,
yeah, that's interesting, because I actually specifically looked up under the private sector part of the Bill 64. They can go back 2 years. So you have to know what your consent was 2 years ago. It's not sufficient to just know what it is today.
yeah,
You need authentic, provable records saying that on May 18th, 2020, this is what it was.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's a good point. So while a CRM will be a good static and a basic system for a small business, I don't think it would suffice for a large business. I don't think it's a dependable way to track consent. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, if you're having to look at an individual's record or profile retrospectively, it certainly wouldn't, because you will make changes to privacy notices, you'll make changes to purposes of consent and what you're actually going to do with that. It's not going to be as is day one will be the same as it is sort of in the future. it will change. It will change over time. So it is important that you're able to have that audit trail to satisfy if you are investigated. So, you know, going back to your original point there, that you can prove what the consent was for an individual at any given point of the relationship that you have with them.
Right. Right. Okay. Let's look at some of the other things. If you're going to give your information to another company, like a partner or anybody, you actually have to notify. So it's not as much you need consent to do that, but you have to notify the person that you've done that.
Yeah.
And then the third party has to give that person the opportunity to opt out.
Yeah.
So to some degree, you know, there's a little reasonableness in there about, you know, carrying on doing business. I looked on the government, the private sector section of Bill 64. It's important to note that Bill 64 covers 21 different laws in Quebec. The main one we're talking about here is the PPS, which is the private sector data protection piece.
Mm-hmm.
Under the public sector, I noticed that and I gotta think it stands for both, but I haven't been able to find it yet. I will. It states that if you take somebody's personal job title and business address and business email and business phone number, that's not considered personal data. So yeah, so there appears to be a B2B out in Bill 64. I'm trying to find if it applies to the private sector. It does to the public sector. So government can use your business information to communicate with you. Again, I've tried to look a couple times, and I don't see it in the private sector one, or in the private sector one. So again, if anybody wants to follow up with me afterwards, I will find it in the next couple of days and have a clear answer whether it applies in the private sector as well. In section 99(8), it says that any person who collects personal information from the person concerned must, when the information is collected and then subsequently on request, inform that person of the purposes for which the information is collected, the means by which the information is collected, the right of access and rectification provided by law. So you must inform people that they have the right to change it and to delete it. And the person's right to withdraw consent at any time. That all has to be included in your consent language. So this is going to get difficult. You're going to have to get your act together and really consider what information are we actually going to use, and then how are we going to actually capture it, track and record it in a way that we can prove it. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And Derek, give the individual the right to access the data that you hold and give them the ability to withdraw that or change it at any point. You know? Extremely
important point. Empowering the consumer to really interact with and give their own choices and turn them off and on at their will is a real important factor. I think that any data protection authority in the world is going to look at a company that's doing that and really truly empowering their consumer with that level of control. It's got to be considered a positive in terms of
from a marketeer's point of view, that the ability to have that granular approach to it as well. So you know, an organisation must consider a solution that will give them a sort of a narrowing and a broad out, if you like, Derek. So, you know, they might consent for email, and then if somebody unsubscribed, then give them a broad out in terms of choices and options, but be transparent and ensure that that individual chooses to stay engaged based on how they want to be sort of engaged with that organisation.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah. Great point. Great point. I have another question here. For how long can a business keep personal data with expressed consent? Could data be kept 3 to 4 years ago? My reading of the law is consent is tied to purpose, or time of consent is directly linked to the stated purpose. If the purpose is no longer in play, the data isn't, the consent on the data isn't. So it's not as much whether it's express or implied, it's more about the stated purpose of why you collected it. So as long as you're still using it for that purpose and that purpose is live and in play, your consent stands until they withdraw it. So a little bit like castles, if once you have express consent, it's good for life or until they unsubscribe. I think under Bill 64, the spirit of that is alive, but the one piece they added was that the purpose has to still be relevant.
Yeah, so you need to have a clear retention policy, wouldn't you, Derek? You'd need to have that defined.
Yeah. And when you've used it for that purpose and that purpose is no longer relevant, neither is the consent.
Yeah.
So I hope that answered your question. Let's see, what else do we need to cover here? There is a requisite for what's called clear and simple language. Yeah. So burying it in, it was described to me that Facebook's privacy policy is as thick as Macbeth. And they claim, well, we told you in our privacy policy that, like the GDPR, is not going to be tolerated under Bill 64. It needs to be knowing. I love the GDPR because the measure for whether or not the person was told is whether or not they understood that they were told. That's the measure, not whether the company can prove legally that it's buried in all this legal copy, but is the consumer aware that they gave that consent? Or is that like, oh, I didn't know I gave consent for that? So I love it. Let's address GDPR and Bill 64 as well. There are some people who say in a couple of areas, Bill 64 is even tougher than the GDPR, specifically in data transfers. Quebec is going to be, I think, very strict on data leaving Quebec. So if you're keeping Quebecers' data, you need to keep it in Quebec. And when it goes outside the border, you need to be accountable for where it's going and the laws of that land. So obviously, if my data was coming from Quebec and going to the EU or the UK, it wouldn't be an issue because the standards are pretty equivalent. So I could do an analysis and say, I'm trading data with the EU and it's leaving Quebec, but I'm comfortable that the EU standards are going to be close to what Quebec's are. Whereas going to the US, it's not going to be that conversation. right? And what they've done in the law is they put that onus on the company to do that evaluation. So data impact assessments or privacy impact assessments are going to be a key part of Bill 64. So it's basically a privacy impact assessment forces you to think it through. What are the implications of this? So that's exactly what the impact assessment is designed to do, is make you stop and think, well, if I send this to the US and it's subject to the Patriot Act and all the other nasty acts in the states that, you know, can do surveillance and stuff, and that is not the principle in Quebec or in the EU, then you're accountable because you allowed it to transfer.
Yeah.
So the other thing I've noticed is they've put the onus on the senior most executive.
Yeah.
Now, there's a reason they've worded it that way, because they're going to hold the senior most executives accountable for privacy in the organization.
Yeah.
So this is, I think this speculation on my part, David, but I think some of the early fines we're going to see coming out of Quebec are going to be to the individual executives,
Yeah,
rather than the company. I think
so the three phases before the legislation is enforceable. I think the first thing a CEO needs to do is to appoint a DPO, and they're accountable for that happening. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct. So I'll just skip ahead. So this is really what a road to compliance looks like. A road to I'll call it the road to compliance.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about here is this single tracking and recording of consent, but there's a whole privacy management program that wraps around this that's required. You know, right from identifying the stakeholders down to being certified and everything in between, conducting DPIAs and documenting policies and procedures, and there's implementing breach incident reporting. That's part of the law.
That's on the first tranche of.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just skip to that. Yeah. This is year one.
Right.
So September 2022. These two things will come into force. September 2023, the bulk of the rest of the law will come into force. And then 2024, September, there's a couple of little stragglers. I haven't really done a deep dive because I've been more concerned about what's in our face.
Yeah.
And this breach incident reporting program, you have to have a complete plan for it. And that plan has to include a log of every confidentiality incident you've had. And they clearly define what a confidentiality incident is. So yeah, this is, I like what they've done here. They've allowed business a little bit of time to absorb this and to change their practices and internal policies and procedures to align with it. So, and they're gonna, it's like, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right?
Yeah.
And here's the first 2 bites, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely, and it will probably take large size organizations that amount of time to outline, document, understand the process, and when it comes to that point of automation, implement a solution that actually achieves all of the requirements that they have to be compliant day one, give them something to grow into in the future. But there's a lot of work in sort of, if we sort of go back to that starting point of the conversation, Derek, where if people aren't logging consent in any way, there's a journey that any organisation will need to go on, and I think if people start today, they should achieve it for when the law becomes enforceable. I think, you know, if organisations sit back and say, there's nothing that I need to do and we'll do it 60 days before, they'll be in a whole heap of trouble. We had that with the GDPR. You know, we were engaged early with forward-thinking organisations that wanted to sort of get on the right side of the legislation. But then we did have people that were contacting us 40 days before legislation was enforceable to say, we've heard about this GDPR thing, what do we need to do? It's like, well, you've left it a little bit late for you to have anything meaningful in place in time for when, you know, in time for when it's enforceable. So, you know, the fact that we're having this conversation today and the fact that you've had so many people that have joined it shows that people are going to sort of sit up and look at it and will take a sensible approach to it and understand that, you know, you have to do it. So you may as well get on and do it now, do it properly, take your time, and, you know, and take your customers on that journey with you, you know?
Yeah, and because there's so much to do.
Yeah.
Starting now probably makes a hell of a lot of sense, right?
Yeah, I would completely agree with you, Derek. It's if you leave it to the last minute, it'll just be last minute stuff that you achieve.
A great question here from Robert. At what point does privacy consents become a serious business impediment? If you know, if the other side of that same coin is we shouldn't have been doing this with people's data all along. We didn't know the politicians didn't know what laws to put in place until they saw what was going to be done with the data. Now they're seeing what's being done with the data. They're going, hang on, you can't do that, right? So, you know, unfortunately, the legitimate businesses who are just trying to communicate with companies are going to get caught in the same net as the suspicious companies who are abusing. Speaking of that, I have to address what's called the Facebook clause. If you profile, you must inform the person and give them a way to opt out of this process. That's a big statement. That's a big statement. This requires a confidentiality policy to be posted on the company's website. So in addition to the privacy policy, you have to have a confidentiality policy that tells you where you're being profiled and what's being done with it. The definition of profiling as this law is concerned, profiling means the collection and use of personal information to assess certain characteristics of a natural person, in particular for the purpose of analyzing that person's work performance, economic situation, health, or personal preferences, interests, or behavior. So I call that the Facebook clause because from what I can read here, it's going to be awfully difficult for Facebook to do business in Quebec if they don't change the model. And I'm sorry, I should call it the meta clause. So, you know, while this is now uncomfortable for businesses, it's predominantly from what I can see and what the lawmakers' position is we probably shouldn't have been doing that with their data all the way along. So if it's a little bit inconvenient for you to change your practices, so be it. Because there's been no one standing for the protection of people's personal data, and it's been pretty badly abused in some cases. So here you go. You know, when an industry doesn't self-police, you know, one of the things I come from the ad business, and you know, one of the things that I loved about it for years, well, we said we self-policed, and that's all gone now. We're not self-policing, so we need to be policed. It's like that simple. The government doesn't look for laws to write. They look for problems to solve that there needs to be a law developed to prevent things. And I believe, again, we've just been so terrible as a collective community, business community, globally, with using people's personal information. We thought it was ours, right? We thought if we collected it, it's ours. Well, sorry, but it's still theirs. And at best, we're a custodian of it, and we need to be respectful. And I don't think we've been very respectful. So if that's going to be a little bit inconvenient to business, so be it.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about confidentiality and security. It very clearly states in the law that if you are going to collect data, you must secure the data. So let's talk a little bit about secure systems, because it seems like the hackers can figure out ways around damn near anything. They're getting pretty sophisticated. So, you know, security of data is becoming a very big issue. And having it central and being accessed is quite different than having it exist in 250 different places in a large enterprise. Because each one of those places becomes a breach point, right? So I think that one of the considerations when setting up your systems is, if I'm going to collect this data, how do I protect it? And I mean meaningfully protect it. And again, given how sophisticated some of the criminals and the hackers are, that becomes more and more of a challenge.
Absolutely, but again, when you're considering a solution, you need to sort of look and see where the data, where the engine room is, how secure that environment is that your data has been stored in, and the credibility of the organisation that you interact with.
Yeah.
Their referenceability within to the Canada or within Quebec, or how they approach security, because it's a USP to some organisations in terms of how well they protect the environments that data is stored in.
But the role of third-party agreements, vendor agreements, and any third-party agreements is critical under this bill, because you are accountable. Your organization is accountable. So you can't take anything for granted. You have to literally document all of this stuff and make sure that you have a clear understanding with all your vendors where their responsibility stops and starts and where yours does, and where they overlap.
Absolutely.
And you have to manage the security standards to which your vendors, you have to understand what security measures they're taking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, we've certainly jumped through those hoops, Derek, in terms of business that we do in Canada, particularly.
Yeah. Well, you don't deal with banks and governments without being able to pass those measures.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've
Yeah.
certainly been through that process.
And we've got 9 minutes left here. I just want to be sure if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll try to address them before the end of the session. If we don't get there, feel free to reach out to either David or I and ask questions. Probably if it's about specifics in Bill 64, I've got better answers. But if it's about, how to track and record consent, I think David's got better answers. So just invite you to consider that when reaching out. This slide deck will be made available to everybody. I will email it to a link to it for everybody within a couple of days of this webinar. But I wanted to address a couple more things. First is minors. So in Quebec, they consider a minor 14 years of age or under. So different jurisdictions have different ages. I think the GDPR is 13, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Well, it varies across territories. It's
Right. And I think that California's is 13 as well. But California, again, or the US have a full act on treatment of minors that includes their privacy. So they're a lot more strict on that than they are on privacy in the US. And the last thing I want to be sure that we cover is really automated decision making. So there's a whole section of Bill 64 that deals with automated decision making. And this is for organizations like credit unions who, throw all your data in a big machine and it says yes or no to a loan or to a mortgage. There's a requirement for people to be inserted, but there's also a requirement for clear explanations of how the automated works. So what I'm seeing is this is going to affect AI in the marketplace because they're going to have to explain what they don't quite understand themselves. So I've seen AI developers who have a solution that starts doing things they can't even explain. So how they're going to explain up front what's going to be done. So it's going to be a little sticky around AI and machine learning. So, just a reminder that consent under this act must be clear, free, informed, and given for a specific purpose. So if you got like a real takeaway from this webinar today, clear, free, informed, and specific purpose. I would add to that, because of other parts of the law, that you should probably be responsible enough to say when you collect it, how long you're going to keep it. So have a retention policy.
Yeah.
I've had clients under Castle that they looked at me when I said, well, how long are you keeping this data for? And they went, forever. It's like, why? Like, what if data is now, in some cases, it's a corporate asset, as this webinar addressed in its title. But in other cases where you're not using it, it could become a serious liability.
Yeah.
So you got to really think about the data like that you're keeping. And there really should be a good reason for you to keep it. And if you can't really justify that, you probably should delete it because it's not of any use to you anyway. So, right? And it could get you fined and it could get you in trouble with your consumer.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Both outcomes you don't want.
Mhm.
All right. So first delve into Bill 64. It's a pretty high bar for Canada. The good news is our adequacy with the EU and UK, although that could be changing anytime soon. The UK is looking at whether they want to blow up GDPR in the UK or not, which is kind of crazy now that you've had businesses go to this length. That's one of the things we got to be responsible, in government about, is when you lay down a tough law like this, you can't just rescind it 4 years later and say, oh no, we changed our mind.
Mhm.
Like this has to be have a longer term thought process on the government's part. So I realize lots has changed with Brexit and stuff, but I think for the UK to maintain GDPR standards would be a positive thing for everybody, the data citizens as well as the business, because a lot of businesses have gone through a tremendous amount of painful change since the GDPR was introduced, right?
Mhm.
And they've done their best to comply, and now they're going to change it again. Yikes!
But that's we could spend a whole another hour discussing sort of the whys and wherefores behind the headlines behind that talk, or the way that they're intending on moving it, because it's an interesting way that they're spinning it, and I don't think it's necessarily connected to the GDPR. I think it's more e-privacy that is the e-privacy directive that they're targeting, but you know, it's being presented by people that clearly haven't got a full grasp on what the legislation is or isn't.
Well, let's go back up to 30,000 feet and talk about all of these data protection laws and what they mean. It's impossible for a company to have different practices for different parts of the world. So, you know, it's been our counsel to most of our clients that they look at the toughest law, set their policies and procedures to that standard, and then trim around the edges for each jurisdiction that they do business in, and make sure, for example, in California, you have to have a "do not sell my data" button, right? That's a unique prescriptive requirement under the CCPA. But in the rest of the world, nobody else requires that, right? So, sorry, my dog is yapping there in the background. Gotta love the age of Zoom, eh? Well, David, I want to thank you, and everybody on the call. I want to thank you for your attention. We covered a lot of ground here. We will post both the recorded version of this as well as this slide deck. And the slide deck has some pretty useful things in it, like all of this, what's covered. So this what's covered is taken right out of the opening comments of the bill by the MP who actually proposed it. So, you know, it does a really good job of kind of giving you a good kind of overview of what's required. So again, I thank you for your time. It is 1 o'clock. We have to release all these wonderful people to get on with their day. Thank you, David, for your wisdom around consent and your experience as to how to track and record it. So with that,
thank you, Derek.
Thank you very much.